Thank you, Helen and Nick, for inviting me to talk about Antonio Zucchi today. Now, Zucchi is an artist who we're perhaps not very familiar with. Not much has been really written about him, certainly not outside his work for Robert and James Adam. And mainly he's been written about in terms of architectural history. He's not really been studied as an artist in his own right. Now, today I want to look a little bit more in detail at what we know about Zucchi as an independent artist, as a painter, not just a decorative architectural painter, but also I want to explore a little bit how Zucchi actively helped develop the very particular characteristics of the Adam style, this wonderful neoclassicism. Now, before I start talking about Zucchi, I just want to remind us that, in fact, the Adam office very much relied upon collaboration between Robert and James Adam, but also between a broad range of artists, craftsmen, and draftsmen. And the best way to do this, I think, is to turn to Robert and James Adams' 1773 publication, The Works in Architecture. Now, when we think about the wonderful architecture and furniture at Kenwood, the dignified south front, the imposing interior of the great room, or the refined furniture in the entrance hall, we immediately recognize the genius of the Scottish architect Robert Adam, and, to a lesser extent, that of his younger brother James. However, the creation of the Adam style was the result not just of the two brothers' understanding of classical art and architecture. It was also brought about by the exceptional team of artists, craftsmen, and draftsmen, as I said, whom the brothers selected to work in their architectural office. The Adam Brothers' 1773 publication, The Works in Architecture of Robert and James Adam, illustrates the number of hands involved in creating this classical Adam style. The designs are, of course, by Robert and James, yet Robert Adam was not the most careful of draftsmen. The task of working up his ideas was entrusted to a number of artists. One of them, for example, the Italian draftsman Francesco Bartolozzi. Now, these fair copy drawings, as they were termed, would then be passed on to printmakers, such as Giuseppe Carlo Zucchi, to be made into engravings. In the case of this particular design, the execution of the furniture at Kenwood was undertaken by the cabinet maker Sefrin Nelson. So we can see that a range of different hands has been involved in creating the Adam style, this wonderful, creative, collaborative process that marked the Adam office's day-to-day work. Now, one of the artists who was engaged in this collaborative and creative process was Antonio Zucchi, and it's his role I want to more closely examine today. Now, despite the importance Zucchi has in our understanding of how the Adam architectural style developed, we have little information regarding his early life. In fact, we have only one document really that describes, one contemporary document that describes his early life as a painter, as an artist. And it's this publication of 1762, published by Alessandro Longhi. It was a compendium of Venetian artists' lives, contemporary Venetian artists' lives. So artists who Zucchi would have known, would have worked with. Now, the section detailing Zucchi's biography is really, really short. It's preceded by this rather wonderful portrait, this Rococo frame of the young Antonio Zucchi, but the actual biography where Longhi is describing Zucchi's training, where he was born, and so on, is rather short. It's a paragraph long, so we don't have that much information. What we know is that Zucchi was born in Venice to a family of artists and printmakers. Now, this was quite typical of the Venetian artistic scene. Artists would usually be born into families of artists and trained by their fathers and elders, creating dynasties of artists. And we can see that from the 15th century as a practice in Venice from the 15th century onwards, really. We can think of the family of the Bellini, great Renaissance painters, or more contemporary to Zucchi's own life, the Bibbiena family. Now, Antonio Zucchi's father, Francesco, was an engraver of topographical views. And he initially taught Antonio Zucchi how to be a printmaker. Now, Venice in the 18th century might have lost much of its political and economic power. However, in terms of the arts, its architecture, music, and painting still had an overpowering influence on Europe. Painters such as Canaletto or his nephew Bernardo Bellotto were eagerly sought by patrons across Europe, from London to Munich to Warsaw. The music of Vivaldi and Albinoni was dedicated to the great and the good of the continent, from the electors of Saxony to the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. Zucchi's family also plugged into this fashion for all things Venetian at the courts and amongst the aristocracy of Europe. For example, his father Francesco had worked for the British artist, architect, and designer William Kent. One uncle, Lorenzo Zucchi, became professor of printmaking at the Academy of Arts in Dresden, whilst in 1766, his older brother, Giuseppe Carlo Zucchi, would travel to London to work as an engraver for the Adam brothers, producing, amongst other things, the engraving for the Great Room or Library at Kenwood for the Adam brothers' 1773 publication, The Works in Architecture of Robert and James Adam, which I showed at the start. Zucchi was initially trained in his father's studio, and this is a very early work by Antonio, dating to that period. It's a series of etchings after antique sculptures published alongside etchings by his father. And these sculptures, these etchings form part of a publication, a book, dealing with various collections of antiquities as well as modern art, so 16th, 17th and 18th century art that could be found in various private collections in the city of Verona, which of course was not terribly far away from Venice. And here we see in this particular series of plates, Antonio looking at classical sculpture. We have the bust and a full-length statue of a Roman emperor and empress, whilst on the right-hand side, two sculptures showing showing Antinous, bust of Antinous, and then Antinous as the god Bacchus, full-length sculpture. Now again, although we have little information in Longhi's short biography of Antonio Zucchi, we know that at some point from his father's printmaking studio, Zucchi then learnt the art of painting in the studios of Francesco Fontebasso and then Jacopo Amigoni, two Venetian painters. Under Fontebasso and Amigoni, Zucchi would have been taught portraiture. And from his father, as I've indicated, he had already learnt draftsmanship and topography, as well as having been introduced to an understanding of antiquity. We can see how Zucchi had absorbed the lessons of his teachers, especially Amigoni, when we compare the latter's painting, The Crowning of Homer, with the former's work at Kenwood. Amigoni uses a dynamic composition in his Crowning of Homer, centered on the seated poet. The palette, as we can see, is dominated by light pinks, reds, and blues. And particularly this comes out in the figure's draperies. And compare that to our own painting at Kenwood, Hercules between Glory and the Passions. Similarly, Zucchi depicts Hercules seated with the dynamic figure of Glory entering from the right of the composition, which is relatively similar to Amigoni's composition in the Crowning of Hercules, Crowning of Homer. And as you can see, Zucchi's palette is also dominated by similar light pinks, blues, and red. Now, this is all redolent of late Baroque Venetian painting. Moreover, Amigoni had taught Zucchi another valuable lesson, this time centered upon patronage. Amigoni would find wealthy patrons for his portraits, not in Venice, but in London. From 1729 to 1739, Amigoni was resident in England, where he found patronage with the royal family, Queen Caroline, Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Anne, Princess of Orange, as well as with private British patrons. Initially, though, Zucchi's career as a painter was focused on Venice. As we still have so little evidence for this period in Zucchi's life, we must turn once again to Longhi's biography, where the author states that Zucchi was undertaking paintings of religious subjects once he'd left Amigoni's studio. An example of these can be seen in the Stations of the Cross, which decorate the interior of San Giobbe, Venice, which were painted by Zucchi. And this slide I'm showing you shows the crucifixion from that cycle of paintings. And as you can see, particularly in the figure on the lower right, Zucchi is using those very typical dynamic Baroque forms. He's also so redolent of 18th century Venetian art. He's also using that very distinctive, quite light palette of pinks and blues. And he's also using a rather sort of almost sfumato technique, this misty technique in applying the paint to the canvas. Again, this is all redolent, not of a classical style, but of a Venetian late Baroque, Rococo manner of painting. Now, returning to Longhi's biography, at the end of his account of Zucchi's life, Longhi states that currently, when the biography was published in 1762, that currently Zucchi was in the company of a certain English dilettanti, and that together, and I quote, they were exploring the most famous cities of Italy, such as Rome and Naples, searching for rare antiquities, as well as looking at modern works of art, architecture, sculpture, and painting. Now, in fact, that English dilettante was the Scottish architect James Adam. But how did Zucchi and James Adam, how did Antonio Zucchi and James Adam meet? Well, and why? Well, James was in Italy. He arrived in Venice in 1760, and he was in Italy to undertake a grand tour, following his brother Robert, who had undertaken a similar tour in the 1750s. The purpose of the tour was to allow James the opportunity to study the ruins of antiquity, to look at Italian modern art, so art of the 16th and 17th century primarily, and also Italian architecture. Also, he was there to amass a collection of paintings, sculptures, and drawings, which were not so much for his own pleasure, but rather these paintings, sculptures, and drawings were collected to then sell on to the British clients of Robert and James Adam back in London. In other words, James was undertaking the grand tour to complete his artistic education, and that which would ensure that the Adam office would become the arbiters of good architectural and design taste in 18th century London. In order to do this, James needed the help and guidance of others, and he soon undertook to employ a wide range of architects and draftsmen who could help him understand both classical and modern architecture. He even went as far as hiring a violin player from Bath to provide entertainment for himself and his entourage who he named the members of the comedy. He also required someone local to help him navigate the Italian art market and to act as an entry to the many private collections hidden in various urban and rural palaces in and around Venice. Antonio Zucchi, with his connections and artistic education, was well placed to provide such a service. And this is in fact evidenced in 1760, where in the summer of that year, a large collection of old master paintings was put up for sale in nearby Padua. It was Zucchi who advised James to acquire the best paintings, including works by Veronese, Poussin, Bassano, and Ricci, so really important old master paintings. Furthermore, Zucchi managed to haggle the price down. The collection was valued at £900, yet through Zucchi's help, James acquired it for only £450. James's esteem for Antonio Zucchi was evident as he wrote in a letter dated to January 1763 to his younger brother William, and I quote, "Zucchi is a worthy and honest lad, a most singular character in this degenerate country." And I hasten to say I do not share Adam's view on Italy. Now, James also claimed in his letters home that Antonio Zucchi was hankering to come to England. Now, this undated drawing attributed to Zucchi that I'm showing you perhaps gives us a glimpse of the painter and architect and other personaggi della commedia who formed James's entourage. And we can see these four connoisseurs in this drawing seated around volumes of drawings, discussing art and architecture in an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity and friendliness. Now, on a modest scale at Kenwood, we have one of these objects in our collections that James acquired whilst in Italy. It's this bust of Jupiter Ammon. And we know that this bust was in James's collection, that he acquired it in Italy, because it appears in the 1773 catalogue from the sale of the Adam Brothers Antiquities. And we know in this instance that this particular bust, it's noted that it's purchased by Lord Stormont, sale catalogue of 1773. Now, going back to James Adams' grand tour, we know that the final stop on his tour was Rome, and he was in the company of Antonio Zucchi. Now, we don't have any letters between Robert and James that date to this period, and frustratingly, James's diary ends at the start of 1762, but we know that he was in the company of Antonio Zucchi in Rome in that final year, 1763, because of this document, this painting. It's Antonio Zucchi's portrait of James Adam, and it's signed at the bottom, or near the bottom, that it's the work of Zucchi and that it's painted in Rome in 1763, the final year that James was in fact in Italy before he returned to London. Now, this portrait sums up how James wanted to be seen publicly as a man of fashion, as a professional architect, but also as a collector and connoisseur of antiquities. So James is shown here in this rather elegant attire, this blue banyan trimmed probably with sable fur, wearing this rather wonderful grey silk waistcoat trimmed with gold thread. And we know that James really cared about his clothes. Whilst he was in Italy, he wrote proudly to his brother that he'd appeared at the opera and that his clothes were so admired, his suit was so admired, that the next day he decided to hold a special party. He invited people to come and view him wearing his fashionable clothes, people who hadn't had the chance to see him whilst he was at the opera. So you can see James as this fashionable gentleman here. But also we can see James and Zucchi looking quite closely at antiquity. In the background, we can see a very distinct item, the Medici vase, was in the now in the Uffizi in Florence. Now, the vase that Zucchi is showing in this, in his portrait of James, isn't the vase that's now in the Uffizi. It's actually a plaster cast taken from the vase, 1-to-1 scale, and we know that James purchased this whilst he was in Italy to bring back to London. Other elements that British grand tourists would have seen whilst in Italy include this very famous statue, famous at the time, of the Minerva Giustiniani. Now, this particular statue of Minerva was so popular with British tourists that, according to one story related by the German author and poet Goethe, British tourists had in fact blanched or whitened the hand of the Minerva by kissing it so fervently when they came to see this particular work. And similarly, in the background, we have another antiquity, this relief, which is based upon a gem, again, in the Uffizi collections in Florence, which Zucchi and James Adam no doubt would have seen when they visited that city. And finally, Zucchi also includes a work of modern design, this extraordinary capital, a capital of the British Order, an order of architecture that James Adam had invented in whilst he was in Italy as part of his proposed rebuilding for the Houses of Parliament. This was a capital that James had made in wax, bronzed wax, which he then showed to various artists and connoisseurs whilst he was in Rome. Zucchi, in fact, drew up James's proposed designs for the rebuilding of Parliament for this competition. Zucchi was evidently James's favourite draftsman out of his entourage. He entrusted Zucchi with this very important project. Now, as we know, this rebuilding of Parliament didn't happen. James wasn't successful in winning the competition. So how did Antonio Zucchi come to work for the Adam brothers in London? Now, I mentioned that Robert Adam leaves Italy in 1763, finishes his grand tour and comes back to London to work in the Adam office with his brother. I also mentioned that in his letters to Robert Adam, James states that Antonio Zucchi was hankering to come to England. So one would immediately think, oh, well, Zucchi must have travelled with James Adam in 1763 back to London with him. Well, that's not the case. When James left Rome to return to London, Zucchi, in fact, did not follow. It was to be 3 years later that Zucchi, with his brother, Giuseppe Carlo, would come to London in the employ of the Adam office. How this was engineered, I'm afraid we do not know. We have very little, as I say, we have big gaps in our understanding of Zucchi's life. Why there was a 3-year delay, we also don't know. And what Zucchi did in the interim, again, we're not sure. My guess is, though, that he stayed in Rome for at least part of this time, immersing himself in the antiquities and architecture of that city. And this would stand him in very good stead once he came to England. Now, at Kenwood, one of Zucchi's first commissions, we saw how Zucchi was still working in a manner that still partially looked back to the late Baroque or Venetian Rococo style. But by the mid-1770s, Zucchi's style had matured and become more aligned with the artistic and intellectual concerns of Robert and James Adam, as well as those of their patrons. And I want to turn to another project Zucchi worked on, Nostell Priory, in order to illustrate these changes. Now, these changes affected the manner of his compositions. They become monumental, for example, and are more closely integrated in subject matter with the classical Adam style. A change also came over how Zucchi perceived himself as an artist working within the Adam office. He is not simply working as a decorative painter for the Adam brothers, but instead he can be seen to be a confident and erudite artist in his own right. And as I say, the best example I think we can look at is the work Antonio Zucchi undertook for the Adam brothers, or rather their client, Sir Rowland Wynne, the 5th Baronet, at Nostell Priory, in particularly the saloon. Now, Sir Rowland Wynne was not an easy patron. For example, although he treated Robert Adam in a respectful manner in his correspondence, he was rudely dismissive of Thomas Chippendale, who was also working with the Adam brothers at Nostell. Chippendale was treated as a mere tradesman. In contrast to Chippendale, Zucchi corresponded directly with Sir Rowland Wynne. Rather than being asked to produce designs for paintings following the concepts of Robert Adam, Zucchi is speaking directly with their difficult client and indeed suggesting subjects by himself and how these paintings should be arranged in the saloon. Now, this is not the action of a mere decorative painter or architectural draftsman. His confidence, I think, is also demonstrated in the sophisticated imagery that he used at Kedleston, which clearly shows he was fluent in the latest architectural theories, had a broad and good understanding of the history of art, both ancient and modern. And these are skills that he first demonstrated, I think, in that portrait of James Adam that I showed you, and which he perhaps honed in the 3 years before coming to England. So the 3 paintings that Zucchi undertook for the saloon at Nostell were completed in about 1776, so the mid-1770s. And in particular, I want to look at the sources that Zucchi is using to create these 3 large-scale compositions, these 3 capricci. And because I think understanding these sources will show that Zucchi was not just a decorative painter. He was engaging with cutting-edge understanding of both modern architecture, but also cutting-edge understanding of antiquity. And a good example is this capriccio, with a pagan temple and a sacrifice. And you'll note that there's this rather distinctive ruined classical temple in the background on this slope. And we can see the source for this if we look to the Forum Romanum, because the temple that Zucchi shows in the painting at Nostell is based very much on the temple of Antonius Pius in the Forum Romanum in Rome. Similarly, we can see Zucchi looking at what can be described as cutting-edge architectural theory in the second capriccio that Zucchi painted for the saloon at Nostell Priory. Again, it shows a sacrifice in front of a ruined pagan temple, but I'd like to draw your attention to the rather elaborate bridge that we can see in the background, a bridge decorated with statues and with this magnificent entrance gateway at its start. Now, this type of bridge, or triumphal bridge, as 18th century architects termed them, was a theme that very much engaged many architects working in the latter part of the 18th century. It's the equivalent, I guess one could say, of attempting to build the tallest building for Dubai or Shanghai that contemporary star architects seem to be so obsessed with. And architects such as Piranesi, this French architect Jardin, all created designs for triumphal bridges. Now in England, we can see a similar obsession to build these rather improbable but incredibly elaborate structures. We can see it, for example, in the work of Sir John Soane, or John Soane as he was. This is a design dated to 1776, so contemporaneous with Zucchi's painting, and this was a design that Sohn put forward at the Royal Academy when he was an architectural student there. He actually won a gold medal for this particular design. And you see a similar elaborate bridge with classical architecture and sculptural decorations supported by the arches or spans of the structure. And even Robert Adam engaged with this particular architectural theme at Pulteney Bridge in Bath, designed and executed by Robert in 1774. So in using this motif, Antonio Zucchi is engaging not just with classical antiquity, but also with cutting-edge contemporary architectural theory. He's also engaging with the great old master artists or classical artists of the 16th and 17th century. And in this Capriccio in particular, we can see Antonio Zucchi looking at 17th century artists working in Rome. This particular Capriccio, again from the saloon at Nostell Priory, shows a group of female figures and a male figure dancing in a circle to the beat of a tambourine. And of course, this is a detail that I'm showing you just to illustrate the point. Of course, we can see that Zucchi in this particular little vignette is looking at this marvelous painting by Nicolas Poussin, A Dance to the Music of Time, which is now in the Wallace collection. In terms of sculpture, Zucchi, of course, is also again looking at the great examples of 17th century art that we can see that would have been available for him to see in Rome. In this instance, it's Bernini. The little detail that I'm showing you from the Capriccio of a sculptural group of depicting the rape of Persephone or Proserpine is, of course, directly taken from Bernini's great sculptural masterpiece, The Rape of Proserpina, which can be seen in the Galleria Borghese in Rome. So the works at Nostell Priory, then, I would say, are redolent of the principles of the Adam style. They draw upon the best examples of 17th century art, the most imposing monuments of classical antiquity, as well as engaging with the most current architectural theory. These sources, Zucchi was then able to synthesize in his paintings so that they would seamlessly accord with the architecture and furnishings designed by the Adam brothers. Now, despite the success of Zucchi and the Adam brothers at Nostell Priory, the mid-1770s marked a financial crisis for the Adam office. Their major speculative development in London, the so-called Adelphi, was losing money. Their financial situation was exacerbated by the 1772 banking crisis, in which they and many of their clients had also lost money. As Zucchi's wall and ceiling paintings could only be afforded by Robert and James Adams' wealthiest clients, the number of paintings for the Venetian artist dwindled. Zucchi would leave England in 1781 in the company of his wife, Angelica Kauffman. He had garnered a certain celebrity in London working for the Adam brothers, for example, being elected an associate member of the Royal Academy. Despite this honest and worthy lad certainly did not maintain the fame or regard that his wife did and does to this day. His name is not as familiar to people as that of Thomas Chippendale, alongside whom he worked at Nostell Priory. Yet, this relative obscurity, I think, is unfair, for during the 1770s, Zucchi was a central force in popularizing the Adam style. His drawings were used by Robert Adam to explain architectural and design concepts to his clients, whilst Antonio Zucchi's monumental paintings acted as centerpieces, to the decorative schemes by the architect and his brother, by Robert Adam and by James Adam. These monumental and erudite compositions, such as those at Nostell, still have the power, I think, to transport us to the Italy of the 18th century Grand Tour. Thank you.